Apparently, I'm middle-aged. I have never been particularly bothered by birthdays. Some people dread them. Some celebrate them. Mostly, I've just had them. In fact, I spent almost an entire year telling people I was 40 when I was actually 39. It wasn't because I was trying to age myself or having some sort of early midlife crisis. I'd simply forgotten how old I was. Apparently, arithmetic wasn't a priority that year, and I just didn't count back. Age has never occupied much space in my thinking. Then one day I looked around and realized I had quietly arrived. Apparently, I'm middle-aged. I say apparently because internally I still feel somewhere around 28, maybe 30 on days when my knees remind me that basketball was longer ago than I cared to admit, but certainly not middle-aged. Then life has a way of reminding you. Someone in their 20s asks for career advice. You hear yourself begin a sentence with, 20 years ago, and suddenly realize you're talking about your own life. You catch yourself repeating something your parents used to say, only to discover their voice now sounds remarkably like your own. The music you still think of as relatively new is playing on the classic hit station. Somewhere, along the way, you've quietly become one of the older adults in the room. The strange part is that I don't actually feel much different. The older I get, the more convinced I become that our bodies keep careful track of the years, while our hearts often don't. Inside, I can still picture the little girl following my dad around church. I can still see the teenager racing into another basketball tournament, convinced the next game was the most important one of my life. I can still picture the young woman walking into her first management position, believing that if she simply worked hard enough, life would unfold according to plan. None of those versions of me feel like strangers. They're simply earlier chapters. Perhaps that's what has surprised me most about growing older. When I was young, I imagined age would turn me into someone entirely different. Instead, it feels more like carrying every previous version of yourself along for the journey. The shelves don't empty as new chapters are written. They simply grow longer. I found myself pulling those earlier chapters off the shelf more often lately. Not because I wish I could live them again, but because enough time has finally passed for me to read them differently. When I was 25, I didn't have enough years behind me to know whether a disappointment was the end of the story or simply the end of a chapter. A closed door felt final. A rejection felt permanent. A delay felt like failure. I couldn't yet imagine that God might still be writing. Now, nearly 2 decades later, I have enough distance to smile at some of the things that once kept me awake at night. Not because they weren't painful, they were, but because I can finally see what I couldn't see while I was living through them. I can see how one closed door quietly led to another open one. How one disappointment prepared me for a responsibility I wasn't yet ready to carry. How one unexpected detour became the very road that eventually brought me home. Time doesn't automatically make us wiser. I've known people who have grown older without becoming much wiser at all. But time does offer something our younger selves simply don't possess. Perspective. Enough years to recognize patterns. Enough chapters to notice that God's faithfulness has been quietly repeating itself all along. Enough distance to realize that what looked like the end of the story was often simply the place where the next chapter began. Perhaps that's why I no longer fear losing the way I once did. It's not because life has become easier. It hasn't. It's because I've now lived long enough to recognize a pattern. God has never abandoned me in the chapters I would have gladly skipped. He was there when I couldn't see where the road was leading. He was there when the plans I had carefully written for myself slowly unraveled. He was there when I mistook delay for denial and disappointment for defeat. That doesn't erase the pain of those seasons. It simply changes the way I read them. Apparently, I'm middle-aged. If that's true, then perhaps one of the unexpected gifts of this season isn't simply growing older. Perhaps it's finally having enough pages behind me to recognize the author's handwriting.